even though we'd identified space as a warfighting domain, that we're going to conduct offensive and defensive operations in space. And I think now we've sort of matured and arrived at a place where we're comfortable saying that, hey, this is a warfighting domain, where space control is a core mission that includes counter space operations, offensive and defensive space operations.
From the Defense and Aerospace Report, this is The Downlink, a podcast about the intersection of space, the space business, and defense. Not just what's over the horizon, but what's happening above it. I'm your host, Laura Winter. Those words you just heard opening this episode, they're from Space Force Lieutenant General Sean Bratton. He's a Space Force Deputy Chief of Space Operations for Strategy, Plans, Programs, and Requirements. And earlier this week, he was a spokesperson for a new Space Force document called Space Warfighting. It's a 22-page guide for Guardian planners that clearly speaks about war, offensive and defensive operations, about fighting, striking, even, and I quote, destroying an enemy's spacecraft, unquote. If you are one of those outside of military policy circles, I get it. To you, this may seem a bit silly because, of course, why have a military branch unless it's prepared to fight? But let me tell you, before now, the Space Force took pains, performed linguistic contortions to use more diplomatic words, like that style of elocution more befitting a United Nations joint statement. Since the beginning of the Space Force, we've heard phrases like congested and contested and a lot about support and enabling surface operations. I've derisively called it the Verizon over-the-horizon style book, and it's rankled space power advocates and junior Space Force officers for a while. So this change in diction is actually a big deal, and it will have far-reaching consequences on Space Force culture and Guardian training and education. But if you think a little bit more expansively, it's also easy to see how this will affect the research, development, testing, and evaluation of new capabilities and the acquisition and contracting for commercial products and services. So for this episode, I'm joined by Charles Galbraith. He's a retired Space Force colonel and a fellow at the Mitchell Institute to understand just what this document represents for Space Force Guardians and for the success of the joint force. Here's our conversation. Hey there, Charles. Thank you so much for making the time to come on the podcast.
Hey, Laura, it's always great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Now, I really need your help here today. And to make it clear why I need your help, it'd be great if you could take a moment and introduce yourself. Charles?
Yeah, thanks, Laura. So as some of your listeners might remember from a couple podcasts ago, I'm Charles Galbraith. I'm a retired Space Force colonel, 30 years in the Air Force and Space Force, doing a variety of operations, acquisitions, policy, test and launch activities. And for the past 2+ years, I've been the senior resident fellow for space power studies at the Mitchell Institute. And so I've been thinking heavily about space power and what it takes to achieve space superiority for quite a while now.
And, you just recently published a really interesting report, a well-read report called Ensuring a Space Power Advantage in Prolonged Competition. Could you take a minute, really just the elevator pitch, because I'm hoping you will weave some of your findings into our broader discussion. But what was this report and the key finding or findings?
Yeah, Laura. So we at the Mitchell Institute held a workshop last October to look at what it would take for the Space Force and U.S. Space Command to preserve a space power advantage over the next 25 years of competition. We assumed that the ongoing competition with China would not be over in a matter of weeks, months, or even a few short years, but it would be a decades-long activity, much like the Cold War was with the Soviet Union. And so we wanted to take a look at what would be required for the Space Force to maintain that space power advantage over that time frame. And we identified several key findings. Some of them are very sort of standard, par for the course, if you will. We need to improve domain awareness. We need to improve the resiliency of our architectures. We need to ensure that it's clear what the mission of the Space Force is. And this is where, it raised some consternation maybe, but I think it raised awareness more than anything else about the fact that the Space Force is a distinct military service, and the American people, Congress, and other services need to understand what it is the Space Force does, why it's so important, and what it needs in order to succeed, because it can't do it by itself. It needs the help of other services, just like all of the joint services do, and it needs the support of the American people, and it needs the support of Congress to get funding to deliver the capabilities and effects that are so critical to maintaining space superiority or space power advantage. And of course, without that, you can't rely on anything from space, and everything else becomes more difficult, costlier, and maybe just not feasible.
And there is also a lot in there about words and using words that actually describe more accurately what the purpose of the Space Force really is and what it should be and what it should be in the future. And a lot of that really was around war fighting, victory, right?
Yeah, so absolutely. As a military service, like any military service, their goal has got to be to win a conflict if we ever go to a conflict. And if that is all to support the deterrent posture of the United States, the military is here to deter conflict. But if that fails, we are here to win. And so that terminology, that sort of phraseology has got to be prevalent in the vernacular of Guardians, just like it is in soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines. And I think what you're seeing with this new document coming out of the Space Force is a clear definition of space warfighting means this, and we are warfighters, and here's what it's going to take to achieve that. So I really see this as a great document to move the evolution of Space Force and space warfighting thinking forward.
And so now we have a space warfighting framework, right? It's supposed to be for Guardians, more so than the general public or lawmakers. But it's also a milestone that's expected to be used in Space Force training, and it's expected to affect Space Force culture, even the words Guardians use in their everyday responsibilities. So let's start with a bit of a long clip. It's Lieutenant General Sean Bratton explaining what this space warfighting framework is all about. Let's listen.
Space warfighting. So a lot of document we've been busy writing, and if I look back in the last 5 years, we're kind of at that natural point where, first couple of years of kind of how do you make copies and how do I get office space and computers and get people hired, like the real organizational building stuff. And now we're at the point where we're really starting to write things down. And so you've seen a couple strategies come out. Space Force Doctrine Document 1 is out. The CSO has really pushed us to codify processes and be thoughtful. And this space warfighting document that is coming out is sort of in that vein of, I think, the natural maturing of the Space Force. And this one is very specific to space superiority. Space Force Doctrine Document 1 covers everything from the organization of the Space Force and what we do and how we fit with the Joint Force and all those things. But this document is very specific to our core function of space control and how we think about warfighting in space. And those of you, which is I think all of you that have been around a while, have seen us kind of this evolution of our language where back in the sort of General Hyten, General Shaw, maybe a little bit of General Raymond area, we talked about congested and contested, and contested was like the big word where we were sort of saying we're going to fight in space, but we didn't want to say that out loud. And then sort of through the General Raymond era, in the birth of the Space Force, the stand-up of U.S. Space Command, we said protect and defend a lot was the phrase we used. And I was at the stand-up of U.S. Space Command when we chose those words because we were just still a little nervous to say, even though we'd identified space as a warfighting domain, that we're going to conduct offensive and defensive operations in space. And I think now we've sort of matured and arrived at a place where we're comfortable saying that, hey, this is a warfighting domain, where space control is a core mission. That includes counter space operations, offensive and defensive space operations. And that's what this document really starts to explain. And we thought it was important to write it down, not not really for you all or external audiences, but for guardians. When we talk about the roles of the Space Force to train guardians, train, educate, experience guardians, I think is the language General Saltzman used in the Space Truths. Train, educate, experience guardians as space warfighters. This document is really intended to do that, to introduce sort of a common framework, common lexicon that we can use in our training and in our education programs, and really write down things that then guardians can argue about and debate and think about and use as a tool in their planning that really is about fighting in the domain.
So, Charles, just to help those who don't follow how the Space Force is organized, Lieutenant General Bratton, he's the Deputy Chief of Space Operations, Strategy, Plans, Programs, and Requirements. He answers directly to the Chief of Space Operations, General Chance Saltzman. Could you first briefly explain what Lieutenant General Bratton's responsibilities are and why this framework comes from his team in the Pentagon?
I'll do my best. So, with any military service, they need to look at what their requirements are for the future, what they need to be doing, what resources they need to align to achieve those requirements, and actually program them into operations and planning activities that then feed into the acquisition world. So General Bratton, his role is really to do all of those things. He'll be in the debates within the joint community to get resources. He works with the acquisition community to make sure that they get what they need, all towards achieving the requirements and capabilities that are needed for the Space Force's long-term objectives.
So this morning, you were able to read the framework itself. What do you think about this document? What does it signify for the evolution of the Space Force? Where are we now?
Yeah, so I think one, General Bratton's comments, I think, did a really good job of explaining this, and it is an evolution, as you say. We've been thinking about space power since Sputnik, right? And it's taken multiple iterations and different views based off of the context that we were in. And for the longest time, we tried to deny the fact that space is a warfighting domain, that our adversaries had weapons that threatened our capabilities. And now, in the past 6 years or so, we've recognized that space is indeed a warfighting domain, which is why we established the Space Force. We're getting to the point now where we're really beginning to embrace what that actually means and acknowledging and recognizing that we need a service that can fight in space and preserve the capabilities that we've depended on, and just as importantly, deny those same benefits to a potential adversary. It's that two-sided aspect of space superiority, space control as a core function of the service that General Bratton talked about, and as this document talks about. So it is a step in the maturation of the Space Force as a service, and in our overall thinking within the Department of Defense about space as a warfighting domain. It's an important step.
Now, Lieutenant General Bratton said that this framework document is very specific to the Space Force's core function of space control and warfighting in space. And he also pointed out that there was an evolution in language. Let's listen to him speak about how this will affect Guardian training and education.
I think the most important thing is the training and education. So we're working pretty closely with STARCOM on how do we get this early into a Guardian's training? I mean, and early into their experience as a young enlisted or young officer on crew. And so I think that's our main effort right now, both training and the education side in PME. I mean, I remember, I went to Air Force basic training, and I learned from day one, here's the offensive capabilities of the Air Force, and here's how they use them. And then as I got more advanced and I went to OTS and I got my commission, I really learned how the Air Force fights. We put the tankers here and the fighters forward, and the bombers come in after the fighters have cleared the airspace, and we use electronic warfare against adversary missiles. And this whole idea of like rolling back an integrated air defense. I wasn't a pilot. I was a communications officer in the Air Force. But I understood clearly how the Air Force executes an air campaign, even though I wasn't myself directly involved in any of that, either as an enlisted member or an officer. This moves us in that direction. I don't think it gets us all the way there on what does a space warfighting campaign look like from start to finish, but it certainly introduces the framework and some of the planning tools that would let us develop that campaign. And so getting that into sort of a Guardian's DNA, just like it was put into my DNA as a young airman, really is where we're headed. And the mechanism to that, I believe, is STARCOM.
So I see this in a few different ways. First, there's the training and professional military education piece, or PME. And then there's this thought that I have that this framework is also a permission structure that's allowing Guardians to speak about the space domain and warfare in the same paragraph, in the same sentence, kind of like the genie we all could see out there, get out of the bottle and finally into the classrooms and on the operation floor. What's your takeaway? What's key for you, Charles?
So I think the genie out of the bottle that you reference, that's been a long time coming. Right, we've known that there have been threats to our capabilities, and we've known that space is a contested domain. And as he said in his earlier clip, we use that term, and now we're evolving to say it is a warfighting domain. So it's been a long time coming. I think it's important to get it documented to say we are at least here now. This is the plank in the structure that we're building. And there really isn't any going back because our adversaries have taken us here, and space is so critical to us that we have to defend it. It needs to be ingrained into every single Guardian that joins the service, why they exist as a service, what their critical functions are, and how they're going to go about doing it. I agree with General Bratton's comments that this document is good. It points them in the right direction. It doesn't get them there completely, but it at least gets them thinking about it and talking about it. I also want to say that I don't think this is just for Guardians. I think that the joint community needs to be reading this as well as our allies, because we are all in this together. And there are several places in this document that talk about the need for cross-domain effects and working within the joint community to achieve space superiority.
Let me jump in here for just a quick second. I do want to say that Lieutenant General Bratton did say that coming out of the chiefs meeting that happened just after Space Symposium, that they did tell them that this framework was coming out and that they did intend to actually share it, and that there was a desire to actually look at it and possibly, use parts of this framework in their own. So, the UK, France, Australia, et cetera,
that's great.
That they are talking and there is the intent to share.
Oh, that's excellent. And, we heard from Space Force leaders at the Space Symposium a couple of weeks back about the need for international cooperation. In fact, the international strategy that came out from the Space Force really highlighted that fact. So it's not a surprise that they intend to share this. And I do want to make sure that our joint brothers and sisters take heed and read this as well, because the Army, the Air Force, the Navy, the Marine Corps, the Coast Guard, the intelligence community, they all need to be working towards the
jointly.
Same here, jointly. Absolutely.
So at this discussion, I really tried to move the ball forward a bit and into an area that the commercial space sector and those Guardians who work at places such as the Air Force Research Lab, or whose job it is to receive and deliver on requirements or to shape acquisition efforts. What would they want out of a document like this? So I asked that if this framework is intended to shape training, education, and therefore culture, then how would that affect acquisition and research, development, testing, and evaluation? That's RD, T, and E in the lingo. And how would this support, getting seed corn for those capabilities the Space Force will need for warfighting, say 5 or 10 or 15 years out? And here's what the Deputy Chief of Space Operations said.
Yeah, I think I hadn't thought about it in that light, but what I'd say is I think as we advance the training and education of guardians for warfighting in space. And they begin to identify the capabilities they need. I mean, let's peel it apart. How do we protect the Joint Force from space-enabled attack? What offensive capabilities do we need to develop? Through exercises and war games, we should be able to, arrive at an answer to those questions, and then that has to go into S&T and demo, and that goes right to policy discussions on how we think about those things, responsible behaviors. I mean, all of that lays over the top of this, but I think for the document itself, it doesn't try and tackle that bigger picture. It really is focused on your job is space superiority. We do that through our core mission of space control and counter space operations, which could be electromagnetic or cyber or orbital warfare capabilities. So, but should it influence acquisitions? Absolutely, it should.
So this may be a bit of an unfair question, but in your crystal ball, how do you see this framework shaping RDT&E and acquisition? Maybe it's just how they even talk about it.
Yeah, so I think the title of the document says a lot, right? It's a space warfighting, a framework for planners. And planners, I think, can mean a lot of different things. One, there's the operational planner or contingency planner, those people that are saying, I need this aircraft here, this tanker here, or I need this satellite here, right? That's what are the tools I have available to me today, and how am I going to array them, and how am I going to employ them? That's a planner. But there's also the planners that are thinking 10, 20, 30, 40 years in the future and planning for the capabilities that we need. I think we're at an interesting time here because Space Futures Command hasn't stood up yet, but everybody's thinking that it's going to very soon. And their job is to define the objective force that we're going to need 20, 30, 40 years in the future. And then given the resources that the Space Force can garner, how do they go about achieving them? When you look at the contents of this space warfighting framework, they define, and that's really what this document is all about. It's about a bunch of definitions. It is a dense 22-page document. So I hope people really dive into it. But they provide an entire array of offensive and defensive capabilities and operations and effects that could be achievable if they were given the right resources. And there are ways that we need to be thinking about this because they are avenues that an adversary might take as well. And so those operational planners need to be considering that just as the long-term planners need to be considering it. So I would expect that Space Futures Command, once it is established, will take a look at these counter space operations, both offensive actions and defensive actions, to say, okay, what type of capabilities, what type of systems do I need to achieve orbital strike pursuit or space link interdiction or terrestrial strike maritime or terrestrial strike, I love this one, space-based fires, right? So they're talking about terrestrial strike, a strike against the target in the air, land, or sea, but from space. So these are the types of things. So it's just defining all of these potentials, and then it's going to be up to Futures Command working with the acquisition community to define the objective force that we're going to need to fight and win in future conflicts.
So in this last clip, I really wanted to get at that nut at what was most important to the deputy chief, to Lieutenant General Bratton. As you know, that when we work on policy or frameworks, there is that one thing that you just want everyone to embrace. And so I asked Bratton, what was that one thing? What was his favorite part of the framework? Here's what he said.
Yeah, thanks for that. It's really, my favorite is General Saltzman published in the Space Force Truce. And this really, if competitive endurance is out there, his theory of victory, Space Force Truce, all these C notes, now SFDD1, this really tries to thread those together. But this idea of protecting the joint force from space-enabled attack, that a fight in space isn't just a fight in space. A fight in space happens to protect, a sailor or a soldier, an airman, from being attacked by the adversary. That concept, I think, is one new to us, and maybe the most important thing. The success of the joint force. This is where it goes back to that original question. The success of the joint force really does depend on the success in the space domain. We have to be able to take away that capability from an adversary. maintain that capability from ourselves, or the whole joint force will suffer. And so it's a big responsibility. The guardians of the Space Force are going to carry it.
So he's really focused on the joint force, and rightly so. But I want your take, Charles. How is that illustrated in this framework?
So it starts with a forward by General Saltzman. And in that forward, he clearly states, and I'm going to read from it: space superiority is not only a necessary precondition for joint force success, but also something for which we must be prepared to fight. So he's laying out that without space superiority, none of the other domains will be able to function as well as they need to. You could make the case that without space superiority, you're not going to have air superiority. Without air superiority, you're not going to have land or maritime superiority. And so there's this integrated approach that we need to be taking here. And like we talked about earlier, I think this is an important document, not just for Guardians, but for all joint planners. And so I agree that is the major takeaway here is the Space Force is doing this. They are putting space superiority as one of their preeminent objectives, why they exist as a service, not because it's space for space's sake, and I've always hated that term, but it's because without doing so, none of the benefits that we can provide from space will be possible. And it's a recognition of how they all interrelate to one another in a joint effects approach.
And it's really talking about it clearly, though, because before, I mean, we've heard space superiority for a while, right? Let's be honest, we have. But
Right.
this is also about the genie coming out of that bottle, right? They're using warfare, warfighting, space domain, joint effects.
Yeah.
All together. I mean, that is new.
Having a published document like this, in conjunction with the other doctrine documents that are coming out, it all paints this library, if you will, of knowledge that we need to be embracing and understanding. One of the things I really like about this is early on they talk about the different dimensions of contesting space superiority against a pacing threat, and how the only way that we can have any sort of advantage is if we achieve space superiority. Any other condition actually favors an adversary. But then it goes to define what space superiority is in terms of time and dimension or scope. When you think about how vast space is, to say that we have space superiority against everything all the time, that's kind of impossible. But temporarily in a specific region or a specific orbit or for a specific mission set, that is possible. And so let's define what that is and what are the things that we need to do as a service and as a joint force to achieve that. That's what this document's all about.
And it's about getting victory. It's about winning.
Absolutely.
So, as I said up at the top, I want to get to your report, Ensuring a Space Power Advantage in Prolonged Competition, into our conversation. Bratton told us at the roundtable that he didn't think this framework covered everything. So it would be unfair to say that it does. But does it get at answering the mail on your key findings and recommendations from that report, which I know was a group effort? And what would you like to see next?
So one of the key findings from our report was the need to embrace the warfighting ethos, and not just for Guardians to do that, but for other people to recognize that the Space Force was in fact a warfighting service on par with the Air Force and the Army and the Navy and the Marine Corps. It is not just a service provider. And so embracing that reality, I think this document does go a long way in moving that forward. Is it going to continue to evolve? Absolutely. As our capabilities and our understanding of what conflict actually looks like in space, and maybe we're lucky and we never ever have to find out what conflict in space actually looks like. That would be wonderful. But in the event that, like in every other domain, conflict tends to happen. So we're going to learn from that. We're going to evolve. We're going to evolve our thinking and our ways to achieve it. But I think this is a great start in getting out there. So I think the actions that the Space Force is taking and what this document represents is really getting after that warfighting ethos and that recognition. It also, while it's not a document intended for the American people, I think it is one of those ways that the Space Force can communicate with Congress and with several segments of the U.S. population. about why they exist as a service and what it is that they're doing is so important.
And what would you like to see next?
So what would I like to see next? Well, I think what I'd like to see next is something I don't think I really want very many people to see next, and that is the classified details. Well, how do we go about doing this? What are the systems? How do they interact with one another? How do we minimize our vulnerabilities and any weaknesses? How do we exploit those in our adversaries? How do we cause surprise in our potential adversaries? And so one of the things that we're going to do at the Mitchell Institute is take a look at what conflict in space might look like. We're going to do this at an unclassified level, which I know just runs counter to what I just said. But there's going to be things that we need to protect and hold at a classified level. Absolutely. But there's also things that I think we need to explore further. How do these concepts that are in this framework, how do they actually manifest when we look at a potential crisis or a conflict? What is use of force? What constitutes hostile intent? Those are some terms.
What's the ladder of
escalation?
Exactly. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So we want to explore some of those aspects in our workshop that we're going to do this October, looking at conflict in space. So I'm really looking forward to pursuing that thought exercise a little further. Of course, we'll produce another report out of that. We're working very closely with the Space Force and U.S. Space Command on the creation of this workshop to make sure that what we find and how we approach it supports their overall objectives and provides useful thought leadership to the entire community.
Charles, thank you so much for your time.
Laura, it's always great to talk with you, and I hope people really do dig into this document as well as some of the other reports that we've talked about during this podcast. Thank you.
That's it for this week. For your daily dose of award-winning defense coverage, listen to the Defense and Aerospace Report with Vago Muradian. And for the maritime domain, listen to Cavas Ships with Chris Cavas and Chris Cervello. And get your air domain news and analysis from the Air Power Podcast with JJ Gertler and Vago Muradian. I'm Laura Winter. Thank you for listening.